Hi guys. Today in this video we're gonna look at the arteries of the brain and the blood supply too. So the brain is actually supplied by the internal carotid artery and vertebral-basal line system. Now the internal carotid artery actually supplies the anterior circulation of the brain, while the vertebral basal arteries supply the posterior circulation of the brain. So you can see here you have the internal carotid artery and the vertebral basal arteries. Now, the common carotid artery actually splits up into two other arteries. You got the external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. So we're going to look at the internal carotid artery. You can see how it ascends and slowly follows up into the base of the skull, where it goes through the carotid canal. Now, the internal carotid artery is divided into four main parts of the artery itself. You got the cervical part, the pectoris part, the cavernous, and the cerebral part. Now, more about the internal carotid artery. The carotid canal is actually formed by the pectoris part of the temporal lobe itself. So, where the internal carotid artery actually passes through into the skull. So we're going to look at the cervical part. So the cervical part of the internal carotid artery is actually located at the neck, where you actually can see it ascends up into the carotid canal. Now the pectoris part actually passes through the carotid canal, and for the pectoris part, right, it's a part of the temporal lobe, so it kind of forms within the temporal lobe itself, and from there it arises or ascends up into the base of the skull into the middle cranial fossa. Now, when doing an angiogram, what happens is that we inject contrast dye into the arteries itself, like for example the internal carotid artery, and we take an X-ray of it. So this actually allows us to see the arteries visually better and identify clots more better. Now, in this part where you can see you're looking at a cavernous part of the internal carotid artery, you can see how when the angiogram, it slowly kind of curves up and slowly ascends up to form the cerebral part of the artery itself, or the internal carotid artery. Now, a fun fact about the cavernous part of the internal carotid artery is the only place where a major artery actually runs through the venous sinus. So it's the only place where an artery actually runs through a deoxygenated area. Now, one of the branches of the internal carotid artery is actually the ophthalmic artery. It passes through the optic canal with cranial nerve number two, which is for visual processing, right? So cranial nerve number two is the optic nerve. It's purely a sensory nerve. Now, one important thing to know is that clinically, an important artery itself is actually called the central artery of the retina, which is important because it supplies the retina itself of the eye. Now, if there was a problem with it, what happens is that if a person has, for example, diabetes or a clot, what happens is that it can affect the blood supply or compress the nerve itself, cranial nerve number two, causing a sudden visual loss or blurriness or blindness that could lead to it. Now, another branch of the internal carotid artery is actually called the posterior communicating artery. Now, this artery is quite special, is actually because it actually connects the two anterior circulations of the brain. So it connects the two circulations of the brains. Remember how I said you got the anterior circulation of the brain and you have the posterior circulation of the brain. So this is kind of like a linkway bridge connecting the two arteries itself. So this is the posterior communicating artery. Now, another branch of the internal carotid artery is actually called the anterior cerebral artery. It's actually the artery that supplies the cerebellum itself. It crosses anteriorly and superiorly over the corpus callosum within the longitudinal cerebral fissure. Now, these arteries are paired, so whatever is found on that side, for example, I'm showing you on this image down here, they'll also have another artery on that side as well. So there's two arteries on both sides of the brain. So they're always paired. So this is the anterior cerebral artery. Always remember that it courses anteriorly and superiorly over the corpus callosum, running within the longitudinal cerebral fascia. Now, for the anterior cerebral artery, what part of the brain it actually supplies is actually, it courses, like I said, it courses over the corpus callosum, but it actually supplies the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, extending posteriorly to the parietal lobes as well. So the yellow part is what the anterior cerebral arteries actually supply. So this is the medial cerebral, or sorry, the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. And the blue part, you can see where it supplies the posterior parietal lobes as well. Now, another artery is called the anterior communicating artery. Now, the anterior communicating artery is quite special, is because it is formed by the two anterior cerebral arteries itself that branch off the internal carotid artery. Now, this kind of acts as a link weight bridge as well, connecting the two anterior cerebral arteries. Now, for the middle cerebral artery, it's actually also a branch of the internal carotid artery. But this time, like I said, you remember how the internal carotid arteries, specifically the the anterior cerebral artery, supplies the medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. The middle cerebral artery actually supplies the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere this time, and also supplies except it only supplies the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, except for the superior frontal lobe, the parietal lobes, and the inferior temporal lobes. So you can see the different coordinations of colors down here. The red one is where the middle cerebral artery will actually supply, but the yellow and blue parts it doesn't supply. Now, moving on to the vertebral arteries. Now, the vertebral arteries are actually paired arteries that arises from the subclavian arteries itself, and they slowly ascend through the transverse formula of the cerebral vertica, the cerebral vertebras, and enter through the skull through the foramen magnum to supply the brain. Now, if you don't know what the foramen magnum is, it's actually where there is like a giant hole in the skull. That's where the spinal cord actually arises from as well. So the vertebral arteries actually ascend towards that area as well. Now, a branch of the vertebral artery is actually called the posterior inferior cerebral arteries, or PICA. It actually supplies the posterior inferior cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, and the coronoid plexus of the fourth ventricle. So you can see the name itself, the artery, posterior inferior. This gives an indication it supplies the posterior inferior part of the cerebellum, a part of the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest part of the brainstem, and the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle, which is a part of the ventricular system you can check out in my new recent video. I've explained a lot about that. Now, another artery that also comes off the vertebral artery is actually called the anterior spinal artery. But this time, the anterior spinal artery is formed by the two branches of the vertebral artery itself. So you can see is how it's in between the two vertebral arteries itself, forming them. It runs along the anterior vertebral surfaces of the spinal cord. Now, the basal artery, right, it's formed by the union of the two vertebral arteries running along the vertebral, it's not, sorry, vertebrals, I mean the ventral surfaces of the pons. So it kind of runs along the surface of the pons itself, lying on the sivellus and the skull of the skull, ascending towards the brain. So it's kind of like a structure in between the pons itself. It's, you can think of it as like the body where major arteries branch off it. Now, one of the branches of the basal artery is actually called the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So, anterior inferior refers to supplying the anterior inferior portion of the cerebellum itself. Now, it arises from the lower part of the basal artery itself. So you can see how, if you look at the yellow part of the posterior circulation, you can see the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. It arises from the pretty much the lower part of the basal artery itself, supplying the anterior inferior part of the cerebellum, the follicus, and a part of the pons as well. Now, One thing it also does is also gives a rise to the internal auditory artery, which supplies the inner ear. So it's the artery that supplies the inner ear. Another branch of arteries is actually called the superior cerebral arteries. It arises from the upper part or the upper portion of the basal arteries and supplies the superior surface of the cerebellum. So it supplies the very, very upper portion of the cerebellum. So this is the superior cerebral artery. Now, for the posterior cerebral artery, right? The posterior cerebral artery actually supplies the occipital lobe primarily for visual cortex. Also supplies a little bit of the inferior and medial parts of the temporal lobe, and a little bit of the the posterior medial cerebellum. Now, the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3, exits from the midbrain between the posterior cerebral artery and superior cerebral artery. Now, clinically, this is coming in a factor if you want to know this, but clinically, it's important to note that if you have an aneurysm between the two posterior cerebral arteries and superior cerebral arteries, this actually can be quite dangerous because what happens is that it can actually compress the nerve itself, causing populus, dipolus, and pupil dilation as well. So yeah, remember the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve number 3, controls most of the eye muscle movements, such as pupil concentration and pupil dilation, as well as eyelid lifting too. Now, we're getting to the exciting part. So, the circle of Wills is a collateral arterial network that connects the two internal carotid arteries, ensuring blood flow via the vertebral basal system. Now, a fact I can give you is that, for example, if one artery gets blocked, for example, like the anterior cerebral artery, what happens is that it provides redundance, meaning if a part of the arteries cannot get blood, there's still going to be the other side of the brain where it's not clogged and blood was still able to flow to the rest of the arteries itself. Now, doesn't mean that one side of the artery is blocked, the other side can take over. No, it's you still have a problem in the brain, because if one side of the brain isn't getting as much blood as the other side, it can cause a lot of problems that it can be lead to serious conditions too. Now, the circle of Wills is actually located around the optic chiasm. So, the optic chiasm is kind of like the body of the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, and it's between the pituitary gland at the base of the brain. Now, this is the last slide, a summary of the blood supply to the brain. So, you have the internal carotid artery, which branches with the anterior cerebral artery and middle cerebral artery, and then you got the posterior circulation of the brain, which branch into the vertebral basal arteries, such as the posterior inferral cerebral artery, anterior inferral cerebellar artery, and the posterior cerebellar artery. And that is the entire blood supply of the brain. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Peace.